Hi friends! As a member of the YouTube sewing community, I love pockets. I know the fact that this is the second video I've started like that as a setup for a pocket alternative project makes it seem like I might not, but I do. I love pockets. It's just that sometimes I wish that pockets were more ornamental and antiquated and made noise when I walked. That, my friends, is what a chatelaine is for. Now, while chatelaine does sound like the name of a protagonist from a YA fantasy novel I might have read in 10th grade, they're actually a very practical piece of historical jewelry. If you're unfamiliar, a chatelaine is a decorative waist or belt hook with several small chains that you could hang small objects from and carry around with you, like a keyring. It's a French word deriving from the term for lady of the house or lady of the chateau. They were popular throughout multiple periods of history, and I want one. Now, you can buy actual antique chatelaines that are perfectly usable. There are also a bunch of shops on Etsy that sell reproductions along with a bunch of cool different accessories, but I want to make this harder on myself and try to make my own using thrifted jewelry. I'm also going to be making a bunch of different little items to put on my chatelaine so I can be prepared for any situation. One of my favorite things about chatelaines is that you can swap out items and carry different things for different situations. So I'm going to try and make different sets of items for my chatelaine so I can be prepared for different activities. But before we can get to all that, we've got to start with a chatelaine. So this is the necklace I'm using for the base of my chatelaine. I got it at the thrift store for like $3. I've seen other people online use brooches as the base for the chatelaine, so I was initially looking for a brooch, but then I came across this necklace and I thought it could make a good chatelaine since it had all these loops for the charms that I could attach my chains to. Speaking of the charms, I had no idea what these were supposed to be when I first found it, but I realized later it's the gifts from the 12 Days of Christmas. You know, Lords a Leaping, Ladies Dancing, Swans a Swimming, etc. I really like the charms, but they're not what I need for this project, so I removed them and added them into my hoard. I made a few modifications to the base. I didn't love these little stripes at the points of the crescent shape, so I added some squiggly bits of wire over top with a little super glue. I also needed to fill these empty settings where stones of some kind once were, so I filled them with a little bit of hot glue. I popped them out once the glue had cooled and painted them with an iridescent nail polish. Before attaching the hot glue gems, I wanted to paint the whole thing gold, so I taped off the spaces for the stones and then painted the base with a primer, a dark brown base color, and then a metallic gold spray paint. The base color didn't show through very much, so I added a wash of a watered down brown acrylic paint before removing the tape and super gluing the stones in. I gave the whole piece a final clear coat and then added these giant dress hooks that I had in my stash to the ends. These are how I will clip the chatelaine onto my waistband to actually wear it. I just attached those by wrapping them with jewelry wire and securing that with more super glue. Then I could finally attach the chains and add some large lobster claw clasps at the ends. That finished the chatelaine, and I can move on to my first set of items. So for the first set of items for the chatelaine, I want to do sewing essentials. I feel like most of the reference images I've seen online include sewing items like pin cushions, needle books, and little scissors, so I want to do that as my first little set. Like, I already have my little box of like everyday sewing items that I use all the time, so I think having a little set of them right there will be even better. So the first thing that I want to make is a pin cushion. I already have pin cushions, of course, but I want to make a little special one. I've been seeing these little strawberry pin cushions online for a while, and I've got these old fabric samples, and I have a red velvet that I think is going to be perfect for this. So from what I've seen online, these are super easy to make. You just cut a little semicircle of your fabric, and then you fold that in half, sew up the straight edge to make a little cone, and then do a gathering stitch around the open edge, stuff it with fabric scraps or whatever, and then draw it shut, and then you can make a little cap with ribbon. And then I'm going to sew like a jump ring onto the top so I can clip it onto the chatelaine, and that'll be it. It'll be all set to hold my pins. You could also put needles in there. I don't like putting needles in pin cushions because I have a tendency to like push them in too far and then they get lost in there forever. So I'm also going to be making a little needle book. I've also been seeing online needle books that look like hands pressed together, and then you open them up and the needles are inside, so it's like a little hand holding your needles, so I want to make one of those as well. To start off the needle book, I sketched out a hand at the size that I wanted and transferred that image to a scrap piece of canvas. I embroidered the design in a dark brown floss using just a basic backstitch. Once the embroidery was complete, I cut out each hand, pressed the edges under, and blanket stitched them to a piece of felt. I sewed the two hands together like a book and attempted to add some embroidery floss ties to keep the needle book shut, but I hated how this looked and they were way too fiddly to tie, so I ended up just cutting them off. It stays shut on its own just from the friction of the felt pretty well. It just needed a jump ring to clip to and it was done. Another chatelaine accessory that I had seen a few times on Etsy were these spool and bobbin holders. They're very cute but a bit pricey, so I made my own by just buying an eye bolt with a nut at the hardware store for like $4 and adding a jump ring that would fit in the chatelaine clasp. Ta-da! Now this definitely isn't as cute and doesn't really match the aesthetic of all the other items I've made so far, but for $4 and a jump ring, I'll take it. The one actual issue I have with this is that the nut can work itself loose from being jangled around. It just slowly unscrews itself and the spool falls off. It's not a big deal, I just need to make sure I screw the nut further up the bolt. The next sewing item I wanted for my chatelaine was a measuring tape. I thought about just buying a keychain measuring tape and calling it done, but my favorite measuring tape has this little tab for holding the end of the tape that I can use to create an attachment point. I just made a little loop of twill tape with a D-ring that I can slide into the slot, and boom, clippable tape measure, add in some tiny little thread scissors, and the sewing set is complete. Okay, so all of the sewing items for the chatelaine are done, so I want to move on to my next set. For the next set of items for the chatelaine, I want to do like stuff that I bring with me when I'm out running errands. Hand sanitizer. I usually carry like ibuprofen in a little like travel case, and I thought about making a carrier for that, but I already have this necklace that has this really pretty pendant. It's this really pretty like gold filigree thing, and it actually opens up. I could fit like a few ibuprofen or Tic Tacs in there and just take it off the chain and use that on the chatelaine. I do usually travel with my tape measure, so I'm going to keep that as part of the set that I usually carry with me when I'm out running errands is my chopstick. So I think I'm going to make a little carrying case for that. I think it should be pretty simple, just like a little tube with a D-ring on that to clip it on. Another thing I carry around with me when I'm out and about are my sunglasses, so I wanted to make a case for those. I cut layers of black satin, cotton batting, and a base fabric and quilted them together in a diamond pattern. I used a metallic gold for the top thread to make it extra fancy schmancy. I assembled the two halves and bound the edges with black bias tape. I added a flap to close the case with a little loop of fabric and a D-ring sandwiched in that seam. I put in a lining and then it just needed a final snap closure. So the last few things that I want to make today are things that I want to take with me to like the Ren Fair. I feel like a chatelaine would be a really cute like Ren Fair outfit accessory, and a lot of those things overlap with like my everyday items that I've already made, like the chapstick holder, the ibuprofen mints holder, the sunglasses case. I think all of those are going to be things that I'll bring. But I also want to make a holder for a folding fan because those can be really handy at a Ren Fair. I've seen a few things online that are like belt holsters for folding fans, so I think I can make something really similar that I can hook onto the chatelaine. And I also want to make like a little coin bag. I've seen these sort of like reticule looking pouches that kind of open up like a flower with a drawstring, and I want to make something similar to that. So 2 more things to make. Let's go. I made a paper mock-up of the fan holder first to work out the construction, and then cut out my pieces from this brown duck canvas. I cut 2 long, skinny trapezoid pieces, pressed the edges under, and pinned them together with the raw edges facing. I made a narrow strap by cutting a rectangle, folding the edges to the center, then in half, and top stitching it down, and I used that to make the loop at the top. I made wider straps that just have the edges turned under once since this fabric doesn't fray too badly and they won't be visible in the end, and I didn't feel like sewing through 8 layers of duck canvas. I sandwiched all the straps between the trapezoid pieces and stitched everything together. This got really tricky trying to sew under the looped straps, and probably would have been easier to do by hand, but again, multiple layers of duck canvas. So it's a little wonky, but it works, and I threw in the towel and just hot glued the end under the strap to finish off the holster. For the coin bag, the last item, I used more of those velvet samples that I used for the strawberry pincushion and traced out a petal shape onto each one. I did some very quick embroidery before cutting each piece out, just a simple star on the center of each petal, then I stitched them together halfway along the side of each piece so it would still be open at the top. I made a matching lining and then sewed both layers together and turned it all right side out. I then cut a circle out of some green satin and finished the edge in bias binding. I left a little opening in the binding so I could use it as a channel for the drawstring later on. I tacked the circle to the velvet pieces at the tips of the petals and at the very center, making sure not to sew through the drawstring channel. I made the drawstring by just making a long crochet starting chain with more of the yellow embroidery floss, then fed that through the channel and finished the ends with beads so the cord wouldn't slip out. I sewed on a loop of the cord so I could have something to clip to, and with that, all of the chatelaine items were complete, and we can take a look at the final results.